Well, the news of the day following Michigan's win over Iowa on Saturday was Jim Harbaugh saying the offense hit their stride despite the fact that they only scored 10 points, all coming in the first quarter. Ashley Bastock from The Blade joins us now. And Ashley, Jim Harbaugh is not backing down from that assessment that the offense is hitting its stride or close to hitting its stride.
Right, and that's what he said on Monday. He kind of reiterated that hey, based on what I'm seeing in practice, based on what I'm seeing in the games at certain points, that we're almost there. So he really was not backing down from the hitting the stride comment from Saturday, and quite honestly, I don't think he feels he has a reason to.
Zach Charbonnet is not going to get the 30 carries he got against Army, but we are starting to see him run a little bit more, so he looks like he's getting a little bit healthier.
Yeah, and the whole thing last week was we're going to do things by committee, our running backs, we're going to split carries, but then you see on Saturday that Zach Charbonnet got a majority of the carries still. So I think whether he was a little banged up, which is what it sounds like, and now he's healthier, and now the whole plan is to kind of go back into doing things by committee with Charbonnet taking the reins. That seems to be the case a little bit more to me, and I think they kind of have their bell cow back, but they're going to still try to get some other guys involved.
And I think the frustrating part about the offense is the speed and space concept. When it works, it works.
Right.
But it wasn't working enough against Iowa. When they did have the touchdown drive, it was set up on a long pass. When they can get the ball into Black and Peoples-Jones and Collins, it works, but it's just not working enough.
Right, and I think that was like the issue in that players got asked about that after the game. That long pass to Nico Collins, it was 51 yards. Why didn't you look there more? And Shea Patterson said they started taking those things away. But the issue for me is, as an offense, why aren't you adapting and finding other ways to make explosive plays? If you got to make them on the ground so that they have to concentrate on the run game and then look to pass, do that. I think that was where a lot of the concern was coming from, that your offense isn't adaptable and, you see a few looks after the first couple of drives from the Iowa defense, and your whole offense just folds. That's not dictating anything. You're letting the defense then dictate to you. And if that's the case, Michigan's offense has some bigger problems, I think.
They only scored 10 points. They won the game. First time they beat Iowa by scoring 10 or less in decades. They're able to win because of the defense, and it cannot be understated the job the defense did. Now, granted, Iowa did self-destruct a little bit, a lot of penalties against Iowa, which they generally don't do. Nate Stanley threw interceptions, which he hadn't done, but give a lot of credit to the Michigan defense because that defense was forcing those penalties against Iowa.
Exactly, and Nate Stanley had 136 pass attempts coming into this game without throwing an interception, and it ended up being 139 because it was on his fourth pass of the game that Josh Metellus intercepted the ball, and then he threw not one but two more, which I think was pretty striking because Nate Stanley's a guy who had 10 interceptions last year and then really worked on his accuracy. So the fact that the Michigan defense was able to force those turnovers was promising. And the thing to me, it looks like the Michigan defense corrected a lot of problems from Wisconsin, and especially in the run game. They really wanted to work on being sound in those run fits, and I think they did that. But the offense, as I kind of was alluding to earlier, didn't fix a lot of the problems against Wisconsin. They weren't able to get explosive plays. They weren't able to move the ball down the field. So I think that's where the issue becomes like, okay, the defense has fixed a lot of the problems, but if the offense doesn't, then you're in kind of the same position you were last year.
And what makes that defensive performance all the more exciting is the fact that they were left out on the field a long time because the offense couldn't move it, and yet that defense didn't wear down. We saw fantastic plays out of Cameron McGroon as he's starting to come into his own, a sophomore linebacker that's really becoming a star in his second year at Michigan.
Exactly, and Cam McGroon isn't a player that I think a lot of people expected to see early on. He's really stepped in for Josh Ross, who has a high ankle sprain, really nicely, and he's a young guy, and he has really impressed this coaching staff. He's a player you hear over and over again. And Jim Harbaugh said, after a loss, you don't necessarily hear about players who had good individual performances. But Cam McGroon did that against Wisconsin when you look at his tackles and everything. And then he took the next step versus Rutgers and arguably took the next step this last week against Iowa. And then Daxton Hill is the other young guy that we've heard a lot. He got a lot more reps on the defensive side of the ball. He had been playing special teams in all their games up until this point. But against Iowa, he appeared more in the secondary. Jim Harbaugh said he's at their number one at the nickel position now. So those two young guys really making an impact, I think.
Dax Hill has got a nose for the ball. We saw that a couple of weeks ago against Rutgers on special teams. Certainly saw that against Iowa. Now, Jim Harbaugh has gotten bland when you ask him about himself. He's gotten bland when you ask him about his team. But when he's asked about off-the-field issues, then we're starting to see the old Harbaugh come through, and he certainly had some interesting things to say about California's Fair Pay to Play Act and the possible consequences it could have for college football.
That was probably the most newsworthy stuff that came out of his Monday morning press conference this week. At least that's what I thought. I think that's what most people ended up writing about. And as we kind of saw at Media Day with him talking about transfer policies, he tends to propose his own ideas, which are interesting and always different than what is actually being proposed via the NCAA or, in this case, the California state legislature. And his idea was that we don't know how this stuff with paying players is going to work out. There's a lot of unintended consequences. And, he even got asked, could this affect recruiting? Could it give California schools an advantage? And he said, we just don't know that. It's too far away. There's too many unintended consequences, and kind of be careful what you wish for. His idea was to maybe make it more like a basketball model so that you're not having that 3-year restriction that players have to be out of high school for 3 years before they can declare for the NFL draft. He said he thinks players should be able to declare for the draft whenever they want. And if they don't get drafted, they should be able to come back to school and not lose their eligibility. So that was his idea. He said he'd be happy to propose it at the annual College Football Coaches Association meetings in the winter. We'll see if he does, but definitely a little bit different take than what the California legislature had on that legislation.
The amazing thing about Jim Harbaugh, he is such an old school football guy, very much a Bo Schembechler disciple, but he is extremely progressive when it comes to players' issues and getting players' rights. And I think that is a refreshing voice that you can contrast it to Ohio State, where Gene Smith stood up there and said, oh, this is awful, this is awful, this is awful. And Ryan Day basically said, well, what Gene said's fine by me.
Yeah.
Ohio State's going to toe the line. Michigan, Jim Harbaugh, he's not afraid to speak his mind.
Yeah, and I think that's like the number one thing with Harbaugh is you really still don't know what you're going to get with him, even though he's been at Michigan for, this is 5th year now. It just is, you can ask him a question like that on a different day, and maybe he would say, I'm just worried about Iowa today. You really never know. And that's not to say is afraid to speak his mind by any means. I think it just kind of depends. And when he feels like he has something to say, he'll say it. If he doesn't necessarily, if he isn't studied up on the issue enough, I think, is when he'll just say, we're worried about what's in front of us. And just because he spoke out today doesn't mean that Michigan isn't. I just think he really had an idea of what he wanted to say and what he would want to propose.
Michigan hits the road this week to take on Illinois. Make no mistake about it, Illinois is not Wisconsin. This is an improved Fighting Illini team, but that just tells you how bad this Fighting Illini team was. They're 2-3. They're coming off a loss to Minnesota, in which the offense did not score a point. They had 17 points. The 2 touchdowns came off of the defense. So this is an Illinois team that's not very good. It's still very much in the rebuilding mode. Lovie Smith, well, now that Chris Ash is gone, Lovie Smith might be on the hottest seat in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
It's a good way for Michigan to finally get that road monkey off their backs.
Exactly, but I also think Michigan has to be careful here and not be looking forward so much to Penn State on the road next Saturday that they look past Illinois, because obviously you don't want to have a game in there that is just a nonsensical loss at this point. We all know Michigan is much better talent-wise than Illinois. They have a much better scheme for no matter how bad this offense has looked at certain points. It can definitely put more points on the board than the Illinois offense did last week. At least you would hope so. So I think it's all about not losing sight of what's directly in front of you because you're worried about Penn State a week from now.
To be fair, part of the reason why Illinois struggled offensively against Minnesota, they lost their starting quarterback, Brandon Peters. Yes, that is the former Michigan quarterback, Brandon Peters. Lovie Smith, not sure if Peters will be able to go on Saturday, but if he does, it certainly will add a little flavor to this Michigan-Illinois game.
Yeah, Jordan Glasgow got asked about that on Monday, and I think he said, I'm actually looking forward to having the chance to hit a former teammate, so hopefully he plays, and obviously we don't want anything to happen to him when we hit him, but it's all about Michigan, and we want to make those hits. And Ambry Thomas said something similar. John Runyon, who used to be roommates with Brandon Peters at Michigan, said, I love the guy. It's going to be weird seeing him over there, but it's all about Michigan if he's playing once Saturday comes around.
So Peterson will be a game-time decision. For Michigan, they've got a couple of nagging injuries. Dylan McCaffrey still not likely to play.
Yeah, that's what it sounded like. Jim Harbaugh said he's still working through the concussion protocol there and was pretty vague on where he is in that process, just that he's still working through it, and a few other injuries that we know about. Josh Ross with the high ankle sprain, still unlikely to play, which means we'll still likely see Cam McGrone in there. And Sean McCune, it sounds like, is still doubtful with the injury that he suffered against Wisconsin.
So best case scenario for Michigan this week, you go into Illinois, you put up a lot of points early and you rest guys in the second half. You got the trip to Happy Valley looming following the game at Champaign-Urbana. Ashley, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.